Hello, my name is Hopwood. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, and this is a short video about a theoretical framework that I developed and have been using in research that's often referred to in terms of its four key concepts: times, spaces, bodies, and things. This isn't an in-depth theoretical explanation, but rather a guide to working with these ideas, particularly to understand professional practice and learning. So firstly, some key points about these concepts, and these points apply to all four of the main ideas. Each of them, when I say time, spaces, bodies, and things, I do mean what you think you'd mean in a kind of an everyday sense. So time, the time that gets used up that is on clocks and things like that. Spaces, the spaces we inhabit, that we work in and live in. Bodies, I mean our bodies, and things, I mean stuff you can touch and lift up, and hold and feel, but more than that as well. And so these other 3 points expand on that more than part. When I'm interested in them, I'm really interested, because of the practice theory background to this framework, in how they are enacted. They're not just things that kind of exist outside of the things that people do in their lives. So I'm suggesting that times come into being through the practices that we pursue in our everyday lives and in our work. Times come to matter through practices and the things that we do in life. Same with spaces. It's not just a container that we inhabit. Spaces are made, they are enacted through the things we do, the things we say, and the way we relate to one another. All of these things, I use the word in plural form, and that's to signal two things. One is that there's not just one version of each concept. Like in times, I don't just mean like clock time or pacing or rhythm or other things like that. There are lots of different notions of time and temporality that come up when we're understanding practices. The same with spaces, bodies, and things. But there are also multiple versions of these that can co-occur together. Now, this comes out of something that Nigel Thrift would call non-representational theory. But it's not like there's one right answer to say, what are the spatial aspects of the practices that I'm looking at today. There might be many different spaces being enacted right at the same time, and that kind of multiplicity can co-occur, so that and lots of different arguments about the kind of spaces that are being produced, more than one space at more than one time. The same things for bodies, things, etc. And finally, that each of these four things overlaps with the other three. They're not exclusive. So it's not like when you look at times, spaces, bodies, and things disappear. Absolutely the opposite. I'm going to say that they're subtly separated points of departure. And I'm going to say a bit more about that. So I'd say try not to think of times, spaces, bodies, and things as separate, in the sense that when you're looking at one, you don't see the other. I would suggest you try and work with them as points of departure. At least that's what I did in the analyses that I've done on this and will continue to do. That means you take each one as a starting point that raises particular questions and has like signposts for different features of practices and learning to look for. So, how do you actually do that supple separation? How do you work with these as non-exclusive but analytically kind of distinguishable, but still overlapping concepts? Well, I think it all comes down to the kinds of questions you ask and the things you look for. So I'm going to go through each of those four and illustrate those. So with times, rather than just saying, how much time does a practice take? That's the kind of the clock time. You could ask, what makes practices feel rushed, time poor, relaxed, or slow? It was something I was really interested in, how nurses who had a huge amount to do all day actually made time with their parents feel expansive and unrushed, and that they were available to parents. And the answer was often through their bodies. What sets the pace of practices? When and why does the pace change? You could ask, what are the temporal patterns or rhythms in practice? And that could be on the scale of minutes, hours, days, weeks, and years. You could ask, how does time unfold or get enacted differently for different people? What are their different relationships with time, timing, and pace, etc. in practice? And there's a question here that you'll see an echo of in all four of the concepts. How can the conditions of possibility for this practice be described in temporal terms? In other words, how it, if you're interested in how it becomes possible to achieve something in practice, to realize the ends or the intentions or goals of practice, understanding its temporal features and the temporal things that shape practices can be part of the answer of how that comes to be done, how that comes to be possible. And then in all of the four things, there's also an invitation to think about the kind of politics and contestation. And so you'd ask here, are there features of time, timing, rhythm, and tempo that are contested or problematic? And if so, how and why? Similar questions now for spaces. Now you'll see in the tables, wherever the kind of what would have been blank things rows, I'm also saying you will also see. So in times, you will also see spaces, bodies, and things. Here in spaces, you will also see times, bodies, and things. So there's questions you might ask if you took spaces as your subtle separation point of departure. How is the same physical space used in different ways for different purposes? How are spaces enacted into being? How does a space become a space of work? How does a room become a space of collaboration? How does somewhere at work become a space of not being interrupted and being able to get on with things? Those are all questions I asked and answered in my own research. This is coming from Doreen Massey, this next question. What trajectories come together at particular times and places to make particular moments and spaces arise? Any one space, for example, it could be a consultation between a doctor and a patient, or an accident on a building site, a space of risk. Doreen Massey will tell us there's a whole load of trajectories come through at different time scales and things like that, which is why we're still seeing times even though we ask questions about space. Here's the echo questions. How can those conditions of possibility for this practice be described in spatial terms? So how does the fact that people are able to achieve this or go on or in practice or realize some ends, what does the spatial account of that kind of possibility look like? And is the production and use of space contested or problematic? If so, how and why? When I say these are echo questions, I mean you'll hear an echo of them in all the four concepts. Now we come to consider bodies. Now, one of the things is, kind of often if you look at lots of accounts of practice, even though they don't say it, it's as if the thing doing the work was a brain or a mind, not a human body. So firstly, we ask, in what ways do practices in this setting involve more than brains at work? Sometimes as an academic, it feels like I'm paid to carry my brain from one room to the other and just, speak in meetings. But in fact, it's always embodied practice. Some practices seem more obviously embodied than others. Performances of musicians are very embodied, or dancers, or something like that. Or, kind of people who might show extreme technical skill or practical skill, like sports women and men. But all practices are embodied. We might ask, in what ways does the separation between mind and body collapse in particular practices? I love this kind of question, challenging the Cartesian dualisms. So you might be looking for very skillful physical work, or the ways in which people kind of think with their bodies, instinct, gut reactions, that sort of thing, or embodied expertise. In what ways are the boundaries of the body enacted in practice, and how do they change? When you're talking about bodies at work, is it just, what's underneath my skin? What about people who wear eyeglasses, or tools that becomes extensions of or incorporate into the body, like stethoscopes that doctors used to hear, or mirrors that dentists talk about as like feeling like part of their arms as they come to see inside somebody else's mouth? Here's your echo question. How can the conditions of possibility for this practice be described in embodied terms? What role do bodies have to play in the story of how practices become possible, and what becomes possible through those practices? And then here's the more political question, slightly differently articulated here. In what ways are bodies, and particular kinds of bodies or embodied work, noticed, valued, rendered invisible or marginalized? What possible sites of contestation and negotiation could arise or do arise in relation to bodies in practice? And when you look at bodies, you will also see issues of time, spaces, and things. The fourth dimension, things. Now, it's a rather clumsy word, but I'm using it because I want it to be an open point of departure and not kind of overthought. Shatsky talks about kind of artifacts, objects, and other things. Use the word things. I'm using the word, kind of things, objects here. It doesn't mean you're kind of flabby about it, but I just want it to be an open starting point. So what are the objects? Stuff you can touch, really. are significant in the enactment of this practice and shaping how practice is done. Of course, human bodies are an object. They are also a thing, which is why I say these are not exclusive categories or concepts. Here, I would say go beyond triviality in your choice of objects that you focus on, and try to go beyond simple enabling and constraint in your analysis of them. Like if you're looking at corporate work, you could say, oh yeah, well, we need lifts to get to level 77 of the building. Yeah, or, you need a chair to sit on at times, or, lights if you've got no natural light, like my office here. I'm not saying that they make no difference, but kind of analytically, are they going to take you anywhere interesting? So be open. I found, pens were a fascinating thing to follow in the research that I did. Other people, like Terry Lynn Thompson, have found the delete button on a keyboard as really interesting ways to open up practice. Ask yourself, how does practice look different if you follow objects instead of people? In what ways do objects have force? Do they make demands of people? Do they trigger actions or changes? Could be, people think obviously about an alarm going off requires somebody to go and try and switch it off and stop the noise, or a power cut happening or something like that, or earthquakes. But there are much more subtle ways in which objects make demands of us and require attention. If somebody gives you something with writing on it, it's almost asking you to read it. It's kind of the object is part of that expectation. What roles do objects play in relation to features like knowing and knowledge? I was really interested in ephemeral objects, how long they last, which links to times, so that people would shape their practices writing on the palms of their hands, which objects and bodies start to collide, small note pieces of paper that they might pass on to somebody else, so they become ways of kind of holding and sharing knowledge and making it available. Here's your echo question again. How do the conditions of possibility for this practice be described in material terms? And the political question, is access to artifacts of practice equitably distributed or problematic or a site of contestation? Are these artifacts in themselves neutral? Often not. Seemingly innocent artifacts, for example, that categorize children as needing special educational support or other things like that, can actually be very powerful and political and contested. So that's going for time, spaces, bodies, and things. And you might be asking, well, how do I use this to understand learning? Good question. And it's one I spent a lot of time worrying about and being troubled with. So I just want to first revise some key ideas from a book I wrote in 2016, which took those 4 dimensions a bit further and linked them more thoroughly to learning compared to the article I wrote in 2014, the 4 essential dimensions of workplace learning. If you're in that book, particularly pages 5 and 6, and then later on 95, 98, 99 are good places to look. I put a little thing there because if I was writing the book again today, there's a couple of small changes I would make. So I'm saying that practice and connectedness in action and learning have 4 essential dimensions. When I say essential, I mean you can't take any one of these away. Right? There's no practice that's not always temporal, spatial, embodied, and material. It always is there. That's what I mean by essential. And I think professional learning is entangled with, but analytically separable from practice. Some people say wherever there is practice, there must be learning. And some people that I have a huge amount of time and respect for, and being a rather coarse in the treatment of these things, but chemists would often say that, Sylvia Garardi and others might say that. I think it might be true. I'm not sure it's the most helpful place for me as somebody who really kind of makes their wake up wanting to understand how learning happens, and I don't think it's the same just to look at how practice happens. So I think professional learning involves, and I would now insert the words, non-trivial changes in connectedness in action, i.e. what Sylvia Garardi would call texture of practice, that further the ends of practices through meaningful changes in the ways practitioners interpret and act in practice. Oh my God, the word practice comes up a lot there. But important things here, non-trivial, okay? I might be on my way to work and the bus comes 2 minutes late. I guess technically I might have learned that the bus is late, but what happened? It might make up the time and then it's non-trivial, or at least it could be non-trivial. You could investigate whether that's trivial or not. But these changes that I'm talking about in learning have to have some bearing on the ends of practices. I'm interested in learning that furthers the ends of practices and helps people accomplish things through meaningful changes in the way we make sense and meaning out of the world and the actions that we perform in the world. Now, how do you specify that? Well, I'm saying that these changes either produce new textures, i.e. new connections and actions, new relationships between what I do now and then, or between what I do and what somebody else does. It might repair, or modify, or restore existing connections between what people do. Or it might help connections stay as they are whilst other things are changing. That's kind of one of my criteria. I also say that professional learning practice is about connecting. Okay, so that connective function. So if I learn something in my work, it's about not just landing in my head, but it kind of connecting out into the world of actions. And I say sensitizing functions, by which I mean that, kind of even in very regulated practices, it's never just a question of following rules the same way every time. In most professional practices, there's also something else you have to do, discretion, navigating something that has some unfamiliar or novel or unique contexts. That's the sensitizing function. And attuning to the work you're doing and the people you're working with as part of that was a particularly big part in the study I did, because that was about how health practitioners related with families, for example. So you might choose two different ways to start here. You could start from the 4 dimensions. You could take one, time, spaces, bodies, and things, and ask how they help you notice and see the production of new textures, connection and action. Whether you see through times, modifying, restoring, or repairing connections, or maintaining them in the face of change. Or you could start from changes in knowledge or kind of knowing that you've noticed in some way. And then you can say, firstly, are they non-trivial enough to qualify as learning, as I would define it? And then if the answer is yes, then can you show that, kind of it involves producing new textures, connections and actions, modifying, restoring, repairing them, or maintaining them? And if the answer is yes, then there you go. So that's it. Look, this is not a very theoretical discussion. It will help, I'm sure, to kind of do some of the reading, to spend some time with these things. For these ideas to be powerful and impactful, I think they have to be a site of your kind of intellectual or struggle. If you're finding them really easy, I'm probably going to say that you're probably not working with them to their full potential. They are troubling to work with, and I mean that in a number of ways. Kind of they should be difficult to work with, but they also trouble our everyday and kind of surface understandings of practices and of learning. They kind of can be unsettling or perhaps even startling at times to see practices through this ways, but hopefully also expansive and exciting, and really helping to notice new things in practice and notice therefore new ways to change and make practice better. That's it from me for now. So thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful. As always on these YouTube videos, I'm very happy to receive comments or questions. And some of you I might even be meeting in class sometime, in which case I really look forward to it. Okay, bye-bye.